The handcuffs clicked so tight they drew blood. Officer Dale Pruitt shoved the young woman face first into the rain-slicked pavement outside Redwood Regional Medical Center, one knee grinding into her spine while his partner laughed from the doorway. Her scrubs soaked through in seconds. Her wrists were already purple. "Nobody," Pruitt muttered, yanking her up by the collar. "Just another nobody." He was wrong about almost everything that night. The woman kneeling in the rain with zip marks bleeding into her skin had once kept 6 operators alive in a collapsed forward operating base with nothing but field dressings and nerve. She hadn't told anyone that. She didn't plan to. Not yet. If this story already has you gripped, subscribe right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Let's go. The rain had been coming down since 4 in the afternoon, and by the time Emma Brooks finished her shift handoff at 7, the parking lot outside Redwood Regional Medical Center was a shallow lake that swallowed her sneakers to the ankle with every step. She didn't mind. She'd worked 12 hours without sitting down, covered 2 traumas, a pediatric respiratory arrest, and a 40-minute argument with a supply coordinator who kept insisting they were out of 16-gauge IVs when Emma had personally watched 3 boxes get stocked that morning. She was tired in the bone-deep way that didn't respond to coffee, and all she wanted was her car, her apartment, and approximately 8 hours of silence. She'd almost made it. The security guard, a heavy-set man she'd seen around but never actually learned the name of, stepped in front of her near the staff exit. I was wearing the kind of expression people wear when they've been told to do something and are already defensive about it. "Need to see your badge." Emma pulled the lanyard from under her scrubs and held it up without breaking stride. He stepped sideways, blocking her again. "I said I need to see it. Stop." She stopped. She looked at him. He had sweat on his upper lip despite the cold, and he wasn't meeting her eyes. "It's right there," she said. "Emma Brooks, ER nursing staff, level 2 clearance." "There's been a report," he said, "from administration." "A report about what?" He didn't answer. He touched his radio instead, and that was when the second guard came through the side door. Younger, taller, walking too fast for the situation. And Emma felt the specific, unpleasant shift in her stomach that she associated with situations that were about to get worse before they got better. "Emma Brooks?" the younger guard said. "That's what the badge says. We need you to come with us." "For what?" "There's been a complaint, medication irregularities. Administration wants to do a standard." "A standard what?" Emma asked. Her voice stayed even. She'd learned a long time ago that raising your voice in a hostile situation was the fastest way to hand the other person exactly what they wanted. "I need to know what I'm being accused of before I go anywhere with anyone." The younger guard glanced at his partner. Something moved between them that Emma didn't like. "It's just a conversation," he said. "Then tell me what it's about." That was when the door behind her opened and Officer Dale Pruitt walked in from the rain. She recognized him from the hospital's contracted security arrangement. Ashford PD supplemented Redwood Regional's overnight shifts during high-volume periods, a cost-cutting measure that the nursing staff had complained about for 2 years. Pruitt was one of the regulars. Late 40s, soft around the middle, in a way that his uniform tried and failed to conceal, with a habit of standing too close and talking too loud and treating the hospital staff like they were an inconvenience he'd been assigned to manage. He looked at Emma and smiled. It wasn't a friendly expression. "Ms. Brooks," he said it like a title she hadn't earned. "We've had a report that you removed controlled substances from the dispensary without authorization. We're going to need to search your bag." The floor of Emma's stomach dropped. Not because she was afraid. She knew exactly what was in her bag, which was a granola bar, a water bottle, her personal phone, and a change of clothes, but because she recognized what this was. She'd seen it before, in different settings, different uniforms. Someone had decided something about her before she walked through that door, and the search wasn't about finding anything. The search was about the feeling of power that came from making someone submit to it. "I didn't remove anything from the dispensary," she said. "Then you won't mind if we check?" "I mind," she said. "You don't have the authority to search a staff member's personal belongings without—" "I'm a law enforcement officer," Pruitt said, and his voice had gone flat and cold in a way that was clearly a performance. "I have the authority. Not without a warrant or documented reasonable suspicion. What's the specific basis for this?" The smile came back. The specific basis is that I'm asking you nicely and you're making a scene. Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the two security guards who were both now staring at the floor. Then she looked back at Pruitt. I want to speak with the charge nurse, she said, or the nursing supervisor on duty, before I do anything else. The nursing supervisor on duty, Pruitt said, is not your supervisor right now. I am. He took a step toward her. Put the bag on the counter. No. The word came out quiet. Not defiant, not theatrical, just accurate. And something shifted in Pruitt's face. The smile dropped, and what replaced it was uglier and more honest. He grabbed her arm above the elbow with the kind of grip that wasn't meant to be comfortable. Bad choice, he said. What happened in the next 45 seconds happened fast. Emma felt the bag pulled from her shoulder. She felt herself turned and walk toward the door, Pruitt's hand tight on her arm, the younger security guard moving to her other side. She said clearly, I am not resisting. I am walking with you. I am not resisting. She said it 3 times because she knew it mattered what was on record. The door swung open into the rain. She didn't see exactly what caused it, a misstep, or Pruitt's hand on her back, or just the slick pavement. But her knees hit the ground hard, and her hands followed, and the wet concrete bit into her palms. She heard Pruitt say something she didn't fully catch. She heard the other cop laugh. The handcuffs went on behind her back, cinched down past any reasonable tightness, and Emma Brooks knelt on the wet pavement outside Redwood Regional Medical Center with rain running down her face and blood starting to well up from where the cuffs had already cut into her wrists, and she breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and said nothing at all. She was 31 years old. She had sutured wounds under mortar fire. She had kept a man's femoral artery from killing him for 22 minutes with 2 fingers and a prayer she didn't believe in. She had done things in places that didn't officially exist, for missions that had never been logged in any accessible record. She could handle Dale Pruitt. What she was not going to do, not tonight, not in this parking lot, was tell him that. They put her in the hospital's security office, which was a small room off the main lobby with 2 plastic chairs, a table bolted to the wall, and a camera in the corner that Pruitt walked directly in front of as soon as the door closed. Emma noted that. She noted everything, an old habit and a useful one. Her bag had been upended on the table. The granola bar wrapper was torn. Her phone screen was cracked. She didn't know when that had happened. Her change of clothes was scattered across the tabletop in a way that suggested someone had gone through the pockets. Anything you want to tell us? Pruitt asked. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and he had the look of a man who had decided the outcome of this conversation before it started. I want to document my injuries, Emma said. My wrists are bleeding. I want that documented. Sure, he said. We'll get right on that. She looked at the camera. For the record, I have lacerations on both wrists consistent with improperly applied restraints sustained in the parking lot of Redwood Regional Medical Center at approximately 7:15 p.m. Officer Dale Pruitt of the Ashford PD applied the restraints. I am recording this verbally because Officer Pruitt has physically obstructed the camera in this room. Pruitt didn't move away from in front of the camera. He tilted his head. You done? No, Emma said. I want to speak with my union representative, and I want the charge nurse informed of my current location. You're not under arrest. Then I can leave. You're being detained pending investigation. On what charge? He picked up the granola bar wrapper and turned it over in his hand like it was evidence. We'll figure that out. That was when the door opened and Dr. Harlan Stokes walked in. Emma knew Stokes the way you knew most hospital administrators, by reputation more than interaction. He ran clinical operations at Redwood Regional, which in practice meant he signed things and attended meetings and made sure the ER didn't embarrass the board. He was 60, silver-haired, and had the particular manner of a man who had spent decades being deferred to and had come to experience deference as the natural order. He looked at the bag upended on the table. He looked at Emma's wrists. He looked at Pruitt. Is this resolved? He said. Working on it, Pruitt said. Stokes looked at Emma. Ms. Brooks, there have been some concerns raised about... Dr. Stokes, Emma said, my wrists are bleeding. I was knocked to the ground in the parking lot. I've asked 3 times to have my injuries documented, and I've been ignored. Whatever concern has been raised about me, the appropriate process is to involve nursing administration, not to have me restrained by security. A pause. Stokes' face did a complicated thing. She watched the moment he understood that she was right, followed immediately by the moment he decided not to let that matter. "Officer Pruitt is just doing his job," he said. Emma looked at him. "Is he? We'll have this sorted out quickly. If there's nothing to find, there's nothing to find. There has never been anything to find. Someone made a complaint that isn't true, and I want to know who made it, and I want to know the specific allegation in writing before I answer any questions." She kept her voice at the same temperature throughout. "This is not a request, Dr. Stokes. This is me informing you of my rights." Something flickered in Stokes' expression. Not guilt exactly. Something smaller and more pragmatic. "I'm sure we can make this more comfortable," he said, which meant nothing, and left. Pruitt watched the door close and then looked back at Emma with a different expression than before. Interested, almost. Like she'd done something he hadn't expected. "You're a lot of trouble," he said. "I've been told." He pulled out the other plastic chair and sat down across from her, elbows on the table, and his voice dropped into something that was probably meant to feel confidential. "Look, nobody wants this to be a big thing. There was a complaint. We checked it out. If you just cooperate, you're back on the floor tomorrow." "The floor," Emma said. "Yeah. I don't want to be on the floor," she said. "I want to know why I'm bleeding in a security office at 7 in the evening when I've done nothing wrong, and I want it documented, and then I want to go home. And if there's something in your record we need to discuss, there's nothing in my record." He smiled again. "Everyone says that." She didn't answer. She looked at the wall above his left shoulder and breathed slowly and waited. The waiting lasted 40 minutes. In that time, 2 nurses she didn't know well walked past the glass panel in the door and looked in and kept walking. A security guard brought her a paper cup of water, which she drank, and a form she was supposed to sign, which she didn't. Pruitt left and came back and left again. Her wrists had stopped bleeding but had begun to ache in a low, persistent way she associated with soft tissue damage from the cuffs. She was thinking about her options, all of them, methodically, the way she'd been trained, when she heard the sound. It took her a moment to place it, because it was wrong for the context. Wrong for a hospital parking lot on a Tuesday night in Ashford. Wrong for this city, this state, this comfortable civilian life she'd been building for 3 years. Rotary blades. Low and fast and getting lower. Not one. At least 2. Maybe 3. Emma sat very still. She heard the ER entrance 60 feet down the corridor go from its usual controlled noise into something different. Running feet, multiple voices cutting across each other. The particular frequency of a trauma team that had shifted from standby to incoming in under 10 seconds. She heard a radio crackle through the door. She couldn't make out the words, but she heard the tone. The tone was, "This is serious." She stood up. Her hands were still cuffed behind her. She walked to the door and pressed the side of her face to the glass panel and looked out. The lobby was moving. Staff crossing at a near run toward the ER. A security guard jogging in a direction she couldn't see. The overhead paging system came on. Not a code, not an announcement, just the activation tone followed by a voice that sounded controlled but not relaxed. "Trauma team to Bay 1. Trauma team to Bay 1. Emma pulled back from the glass. Her mind had already shifted into a different mode. Not the careful, watchful mode she'd been running in for the past hour, but something older and more immediate. Assessment. Resource inventory. Priority triage. She heard the doors at the far end of the corridor slam open. Heavy footsteps. More than one person. She heard a voice she didn't know say, clipped and clear. "Multiple GSW, 2 shrapnel wounds, BP 62/40 on transport. We need your best trauma team in Bay 1 right now." She heard someone else say, "Who is this patient?" And the first voice said something she only caught part of. A rank and a name, and then 4 words she heard completely. "Classified. Secure the building." Emma pressed back to the glass. 6 men in civilian clothes and tactical boots had come through the ER entrance and were now in the corridor, and the word civilian was doing a lot of work because these men moved the way military moved, spread and deliberate, with the particular economy of people who had trained the excess out of their bodies. 2 of them had earpieces. All of them had the look of people for whom the word perimeter was a professional concept. The tallest one, mid-40s, close-cropped gray hair, a jaw set like load-bearing concrete, stopped in the middle of the corridor and said to the nurse at the desk, "Where's your combat trauma specialist?" The nurse said, "Our what?" "Combat trauma. Whoever here has the most experience with penetrating ballistic injury and field-applied hemorrhage control. Who is it?" "We have our ER attending, Doctor." "Not a physician," the man said. "A nurse. Combat background. ER experience." "Who?" There was a pause. Emma watched through the glass as the desk nurse said something, turned to another nurse, and both of them looked blankly back at him. "We don't really have... our nursing staff is mostly..." The man in the hallway turned and looked directly at the door of the security office. Emma couldn't tell, from where she was standing, what he saw, but his expression changed. He took 3 steps toward the door and stopped. And then he said a name. Her name. He said it quietly, more to himself than anyone else, in the tone of someone working out a problem they hadn't expected to encounter. But she heard it through the glass because she'd been trained to hear her designation under worse conditions than this. She stepped back into the center of the room. Her hands were still cuffed behind her. She was in rain-soaked scrubs with blood on both wrists and a cracked phone on the table and a week-old granola bar torn open next to it. The door opened. He was taller than he'd looked through the glass. He had a scar along his left temple that was a few years old, and he was wearing a jacket that had the particular non-logo blandness of something specifically chosen not to identify anything. He looked at her wrists. He looked at the cuffs. Something moved through his face that was not a small thing. "Brooks," he said. Not a question this time. "Major Calloway," she said. She hadn't seen him in 3 years. The last time she'd seen him was in a field hospital, in a location that officially didn't exist, where he'd been in the next bay down, and she'd had her hands full keeping 2 of his operators from dying from blood loss while the remainder of the mission was still active outside. He had clearly not expected to find her in handcuffs in a hospital security office in Ashford. "Why are you cuffed?" he said. "They said there was a complaint about medication," Emma said. It was not a conversation that went well. He stared at her for a second. Then he turned and looked back into the corridor, and his voice went up about 30% in volume without losing any of its composure. "Who put restraints on this woman?" The corridor went quiet in a way that corridors rarely go quiet. Pruitt appeared at the edge of her sightline, coming from somewhere to the left. His expression was the expression of a man who had been comfortable 30 seconds ago and was now doing rapid recalculations. "I'm Officer Pruitt, Ashford PD. I'm not asking who you are," Calloway said. "I'm asking who authorized restraints on a member of a classified federal medical support unit." Pruitt's mouth opened. Then it closed. "She's a nurse," he said. "She's a hospital." "Remove the restraints," Calloway said. "Right now." There was a pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds but felt like considerably more. Then Pruitt came into the security office and uncuffed her, and his hands had a slight tremor she was pretty sure wasn't there before, and he didn't say anything at all. Emma rubbed her wrists. The skin was marked and sore and would need attention. She'd deal with it later. Calloway looked at her. "We've got a critical in Bay 1, he said. "Commander Rice, he took 2 rounds and a shrapnel cluster in a building collapse during extraction. BP's in the floor. Your ER attending is in over his head." Emma was already moving toward the door. "Tell them not to intubate until I'm in the room," she said. "His airway presentation is going to be misleading. If they intubate on visual, they'll make it worse." Calloway said something into his earpiece, fast and terse. Emma walked out of the security office and down the corridor toward Bay 1. And she did not look back at Dale Pruitt, and she did not look at Dr. Stokes, who was standing near the nursing station with a tablet in his hand and an expression on his face she didn't have time to interpret. She pushed through the doors into the trauma bay. The man on the table was 52 years old and had the build of someone who had never once in his adult life made a decision that prioritized comfort over function. Commander Rice. She'd heard the name on 3 separate classified briefings and never expected to see the face attached to it. His shirt had been cut away by the transport medics, and 2 wound packs had been applied, field applied, good technique, whoever did it knew what they were doing, but the bleeds they'd treated were the visible ones, and Emma could see from across the room that there was something else happening that they'd missed. "Hold," she said, and the ER attending, Dr. Ferris, she knew him, competent on ordinary nights, looked up with the expression of a man who was very close to his ceiling. "Brooks, I need to—" "His neck veins," she said, stepping to the table. "See how they're distended?" She put 2 fingers at the base of his throat, then moved to his chest and pressed at the second intercostal space on the left. She felt what she was looking for. Tension pneumo. He doesn't need intubation yet, he needs decompression. Right side, second ICS, mid-clavicular. Ferris stared at her, then at her wrists, then at the men in tactical boots who had come through the door behind her. I am telling you what this patient needs, Emma said, and her voice was not unkind, but it was not asking. 14-gauge needle right now. Let's go. Ferris blinked once. Then he nodded and called for the equipment, and the bay shifted back into motion around her, and Emma Brooks, rain-soaked, marked from restraints, 3 years out of a uniform she'd never officially worn in this building, put her hands on a dying man and went to work. At the edge of her vision, through the porthole window in the trauma bay door, she could see Dale Pruitt standing in the corridor with his arms at his sides, watching. She didn't know what he was feeling. She didn't particularly care. She heard the tension pneumothorax release under the needle, the sharp, definitive hiss of air that told her she'd been right. And Commander Rice's blood pressure started to climb on the monitor, and the attending finally exhaled. "Good call," Ferris said quietly. "There's more," Emma said. "Let's find all of it." Outside in the corridor, she could hear voices. Multiple, arriving fast, with the particular energy of people who have flown a long way in a hurry and landed somewhere they did not expect. She could hear Calloway on his radio. She could hear something that sounded like a second vehicle convoy arriving at the emergency entrance. Whatever was coming through those doors, it was going to change the shape of this night significantly. Emma kept her eyes on the patient and kept working. The hiss of decompressed air from Commander Rice's chest cavity was the most honest sound in the room, clean, decisive, biological cause and effect, with no bureaucratic interference. And Emma didn't pause to appreciate it because the monitor was showing her the next problem before the first one had fully resolved. His pressure was climbing, but not fast enough. 68/44. Better than 62/40, but not by enough. And the trajectory of the climb told her the needle decompression had addressed the immediate crisis without touching the underlying volume deficit. He was still bleeding somewhere. The field wound packs on his left flank and right shoulder were holding, which meant it wasn't there. She pressed her fingers along his lower ribs and felt what she'd half expected. "He's got a bleeder under the left diaphragm," she said. "The shrapnel wound on his back. Did anyone image it on transport?" The medic who'd come in with Rice, young, competent-looking, operating at the upper edge of his training, said, "We didn't have imaging capability on the bird. We flagged it as possible internal." "It's not possible," Emma said. "Get me a fast exam right now." Ferris was already reaching for the ultrasound probe. His hands were steadier now than they'd been 2 minutes ago, which Emma noted without comment. Some people improved under the presence of someone who knew what they were doing. It wasn't weakness, just physics. The fast confirmed it in 40 seconds. Free fluid in the left upper quadrant, more than could be explained by the visible injuries. The ultrasound image was grainy and imprecise, but unambiguous in the way that mattered. "He needs the OR," Emma said. "How long to get a surgical team?" "Dr. Wainwright is on call," the charge nurse said. "She's here. She was in a case. Get her out of the case. What's she in?" "Appendectomy. She's about 20 minutes from closure." Emma did the arithmetic. "Tell her to close fast. We can buy 20 minutes if we push fluids and stay ahead of the pressure drop. 2 large-bore IVs, run wide open, O negative until we can type and cross. And I want a vasopressor ready, but don't hang it yet." She looked at the medic. "When you found him, was he conscious?" "In and out. He recognized Major Calloway during initial contact. After that, he was mostly nonverbal." "Any indication of head involvement?" "We didn't have imaging," the medic said again, with the particular flatness of someone who has already given this answer and doesn't enjoy giving it. "Okay," Emma said. "Not criticism, just acknowledgement. Watch his pupils every 2 minutes. If they change, tell me before you tell anyone else." She stepped back half a pace and let the team settle into the rhythm she'd set, because the worst thing she could do right now was stand at the table micromanaging people who were competent enough to execute without her hovering. She'd seen attendings do that, fill the space with their own anxiety until the team around them caught it like an infection. Rice couldn't afford anxiety. He needed the room to work. She looked at the monitor, 71/48, still climbing but fighting for every point. Behind her, through the porthole window in the bay door, she could see the corridor had changed in the last 4 minutes. There were more people out there now, Not hospital staff, not the original six who'd come in with Rice, and they were having conversations that involved a lot of eye contact and not a lot of movement, which in Emma's experience meant decisions were being made. She turned back to the patient. "Stay with me, Commander," she said quietly, not expecting a response. It was just something she'd always done: talked to unconscious patients, told them what was happening, gave them something to orient toward. She'd picked it up from a nurse in her first overseas posting who'd told her it didn't matter if they couldn't hear you, it mattered that you were still treating them like a person and not a problem. Reese's left hand twitched. It was small and probably involuntary, but she noted it. The bay door opened and Calloway came in. He looked at Rice, then at the monitors, then at Emma, and he did it in that order, which told her something about his priorities that she'd already suspected. "Surgical team? 20 minutes to OR. He'll make it if nothing else surprises us in the next 15. What are the odds of something else surprising us?" "In my experience," Emma said, "never zero." He almost smiled. Almost. "What do you need?" "Right now, for him to stay stable long enough for Wainwright to get scrubbed." She glanced toward the door. "Who else is out there?" "Colonel Hargrove landed 40 minutes ago. She's been briefed on the situation." Emma processed the name and rank. "Hargrove is JAG." "Hargrove is a lot of things," Calloway said. "Tonight she's the person with the authority to make what happened to you in that parking lot into a documented federal matter." Emma looked at him. "That's not why you came." "No," he said. "We came for Rice. The other thing—" He stopped and glanced at her wrists, which she'd wrapped loosely with gauze from the trauma cart when nobody was actively watching. "The other thing is going to happen regardless of what I want because there's footage." "Of course there's footage," Emma said. She hadn't doubted it. The hospital had cameras covering every exterior entrance. She'd walked through them for 3 years. Whatever Pruitt thought he was doing tonight, he'd done it on camera. "Hargrove saw it before she landed," Calloway said. "She was already making calls on the helicopter." Emma turned back to the monitor. 74/51. The vasopressor was still hanging unused, which was where she wanted it. "Good," she said. "But right now I need you out of this bay unless you have medical training I'm not aware of." He left without arguing. Another thing she'd always respected about Calloway: he knew which rooms he belonged in. Dr. Wainwright arrived 14 minutes later, which was faster than 20 and slower than Emma would have preferred, wearing scrubs with a small blood stain on the left sleeve from the appendectomy and an expression of intense professional focus that immediately made Emma trust her. Wainwright was 50-something with short, natural hair and the hands of someone who operated frequently. Small calibrations of movement, nothing wasted. She looked at the fast image and the vitals and asked 2 specific questions and listened to the answers and then said, "Let's go." And the OR team moved Rice out of Bay 1 in under 3 minutes, with Emma walking beside the gurney until the elevator. "You're Brooks?" Wainwright asked, just before the doors. "Yes." "Ferris said you caught the tension pneumo before anyone else in the room." "The neck veins," Emma said. "Classic presentation." "He said you also called the subdiaphragmatic bleed from palpation before the fast confirmed it." Emma looked at her. "Is this going somewhere?" Wainwright studied her for a second. "I heard what happened to you tonight, before all this." Emma didn't say anything. "For what it's worth," Wainwright said, "it's embarrassing for this hospital, what they did to you." "Right now I care more about what's happening to your patient," Emma said. Wainwright held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, with the elevator doors open behind her, and said, "So do I." She stepped through and the doors closed and Commander Rice was gone up toward the 4th floor. And Emma stood in the corridor with her wrapped wrists and her ruined scrubs and the weight of the last 2 hours pressing down on her all at once. She breathed through it. The family waiting area outside the ER was empty at this hour, except for a man sleeping under a jacket in the corner and a vending machine with a broken light in the C column. Emma sat in a chair near the window and put her forearms on her knees and looked at the floor and gave herself about 4 minutes to feel everything she'd been not feeling for the past 2 hours. Her wrists hurt. Her knees, where she'd hit the pavement, were stiffening up under the wet scrubs. She was hungry, in the jittery way that came from adrenaline metabolizing faster than available food, and she had not had anything except the paper cup of water Pruitt's security guard had brought her, and the granola bar that had been opened and resealed and opened again by whoever went through her bag. She was also aware, calmly, rationally aware, that she was angry. Not the reactive kind of angry that wanted to shout or throw something, but the slow, precise kind that settled in and stayed and wanted documented evidence and formal process and accountability with paper trails. She'd felt this before. It was a useful kind of angry if you pointed it correctly. She was sitting there when the woman found her. Colonel Hargrove was not what the rank suggested, which was probably intentional. She was in her mid-40s, slight, wearing civilian clothes that were expensive without advertising it, with dark hair pulled back and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she probably wore constantly and forgot about. She moved into the waiting area without urgency, looked at Emma, and sat down 2 chairs over. "I've been looking for you," she said. "I've been here," Emma said. "How are your wrists?" "They'll need proper cleaning and maybe a stitch or 2 at the lateral right. Everything else is soft tissue. I want you seen by someone before the end of the night." "I will be," Emma said. "After." Hargrove looked at the window. Outside, the rain had eased to a drizzle, and the parking lot was lit with the particular flat orange of security lighting. There were 2 vehicles out there that hadn't been there before. Dark, unmarked, with the body style of government fleet. "I've reviewed the exterior camera footage from the main staff exit," Hargrove said. "Both the parking lot camera and the secondary coverage from the corner of the building." Emma waited. "Your account of the sequence of events is accurate," Hargrove said. "All of it. The illegal search, the application of restraints without documented cause, the failure to log the detainment through proper channels, and the physical contact that resulted in you falling." She paused. "The camera from the secondary angle shows Officer Pruitt's hand on your back at the moment of the fall." Emma looked at the floor. "He pushed you," Hargrove said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know if it was deliberate," Emma said. "I don't actually know what his hand was doing. I know the result. The result is documented. The rest is for an investigator to determine." Hargrove shifted in the chair. "What I'm going to tell you now is not privileged information, but I'd prefer it stays in this room for the moment. There have been 3 prior complaints against Officer Pruitt in the past 14 months. 2 from hospital staff, 1 from a patient's family member. All 3 went into a drawer somewhere in the Ashford PD's Internal Affairs office and did not come back out." Emma looked up at her. "The 2 from hospital staff," Hargrove continued, "were female nurses. Both of them were told the matter was under review. Both of them stopped pursuing it after a follow-up meeting with department supervisors. I don't know what happened in those meetings. I intend to find out." "What's your jurisdiction here?" Emma asked. "My jurisdiction is Commander Rice," Hargrove said. "The federal nexus comes through his status and the circumstances of his injury. The events involving you tonight occurred on federal property pursuant to a contracted law enforcement arrangement that the Department of Defense has a documented interest in. The jurisdictional reach is, let's say, adequate for what needs to happen." Emma studied her profile. "You moved fast. You were already making calls before you landed." "I was making calls when I saw the footage." Hargrove turned and looked at her directly. "I want to be clear about something, Ms. Brooks. What I'm doing tonight is not about you specifically. It is not about your service record, which I have read, and which is impressive, and which you should feel no obligation to use as a shield. It is about what happened on that pavement, which was wrong independently of who you are and what you've done. Your history does not make this worse. It also does not make it more valid. The validity of the wrong was established when it happened." Emma looked at her for a long moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Hargrove said. "Now, your record." She folded her hands. "I need to confirm several items for the purposes of the federal documentation I'm preparing tonight. You served with the 112th Combat Medical Support Detachment for 4 years. Yes. You were attached to Tier 1 operational units on 12 classified deployments. Yes. You received the Army Commendation Medal with Valor, the Combat Medical Badge, and 2 unit citations that are currently sealed under National Security Classification. Yes. And you have been working as a civilian emergency room nurse at this hospital for 3 years, 4 months, with no disciplinary record, no complaint history, and performance evaluations that your nursing supervisor described. And I'm quoting from a statement she gave me 40 minutes ago, as among the best I've seen in 22 years of hospital management." Emma was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know she said that." "She said it on the record." Hargrove stood up, straightening her jacket. "I need to make several more calls. I'd like you to stay in the building for the next 2 hours. Not because you're required to. You are not required to do anything you're not comfortable with, but because there are things that are going to happen tonight that you may want to be present for. She left without ceremony, which Emma appreciated more than any number of formal gestures would have warranted. The 2 hours passed in fragments. Emma had her wrists properly cleaned and dressed by one of the night shift nurses she actually knew well, a woman named Petra, who said nothing about the circumstances and simply did the work carefully and with appropriate supplies, which was the most professional courtesy anyone had shown her all evening. She drank 2 cups of bad coffee from the break room and ate crackers from the crash cart supply closet that was technically not for personal consumption but had been raided by night staff since approximately forever. She checked the OR board twice. Commander Rice was still in surgery, which at 90 minutes in was within expected parameters for the injuries she'd triaged. She was not going to know the outcome before morning, and she'd made a certain peace with that. What she was not making peace with, could not, despite trying, was the image of the desk nurse's face through the lobby glass. Earlier, when she'd been walked out in handcuffs. The expression that had been there for exactly 1 second before the nurse looked away. Not shock, not outrage. Calculation. The rapid assessment of whether being seen caring about this was going to cost anything. Emma understood it. She didn't forgive it easily, but she understood it. Institutions train that response into people the way water carved channels. Not through malice, just through consistent, repeated pressure. You learned what happened to people who made noise. You learned the shape of the drawer where complaints went. You stayed quiet, not because you were cowardly, but because you'd seen what loud got you. She was thinking about this, sitting at the end of an empty corridor near the staff lounge, when she heard the voices. She couldn't make out words at first, just the volume and tone, which was elevated and contained the particular register of someone who had been maintaining composure for several hours and was reaching the end of their supply. She stood up and walked toward the sound and turned the corner into the corridor that connected the administrative wing to the main nursing station. Dr. Harlan Stokes was standing in the corridor with Calloway and a woman Emma hadn't seen before, heavyset, late 50s, in a suit that was slightly too formal for the hour, holding a tablet against her chest. Hospital legal, Emma guessed, by the way she was holding the tablet like it was armor. Cannot access personnel files without a formal request through hospital administration, Stokes was saying. His voice had the measured quality of someone reading from a remembered policy while also privately panicking. There are privacy protections in place that... The subpoena covers the employment records, Calloway said. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't doing anything with his body language that was aggressive. He was just immovable. The nursing supervisor's statements have already been collected. What I need now is the security footage archive for the past 30 days. The security footage is proprietary hospital property. Dr. Stokes, Calloway looked at him, just looked. The federal preservation letter was served to your facility 8 minutes ago. Anything that gets deleted between now and the close of the investigation is obstruction. I'm telling you this as a courtesy. Stokes's jaw moved. The legal woman touched his arm. Harlan, she said quietly. He didn't answer her. I was looking somewhere past Calloway's shoulder, and Emma watched his face cycle through several things before landing on something that looked like the beginning of understanding. Not remorse. Not yet. But the dawning recognition that the shape of this situation had changed in ways he hadn't accounted for when he'd walked into the security office and said the words the officer was just doing his job. He saw Emma at the edge of the corridor. The eye contact lasted maybe 2 seconds. She didn't hold it for drama. She just looked at him with the same evenness she'd been maintaining all night. And then she looked away and walked back toward the waiting area. Behind her, she heard Stokes say something in a lower register that she didn't try to catch. She heard Calloway's response, which was 3 words and completely inaudible. She turned the corner. She almost walked directly into Dale Pruitt. He was in the corridor outside the main nursing station, standing with another Ashford PD officer she didn't recognize, younger, uncomfortable looking, one hand resting near his belt in the posture of someone who'd been told to stand by and wasn't sure what for. Pruitt himself had lost the comfortable authority he'd carried earlier. He was standing differently. Something in his weight distribution that was slightly less planted, slightly more aware of the exits. He saw her. His expression went through several things in quick succession. Emma stopped walking. She didn't back up, didn't change her posture, didn't say anything. She just stood in the corridor and looked at him with approximately the same energy she'd give a radiographic result that was telling her something she already knew. "Ms. Brooks," he said. His voice had a different texture than it had in the security office. She didn't answer. "Look," he said, and then he stopped and started again. "The complaint we received that came through administration. I was acting on Officer Pruitt," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "You should not be talking to me." He blinked. "Without your attorney present," she said, "you should not be talking to me." The younger officer took a small step sideways, away from Pruitt. The micro-movement of a man who has just processed that he is standing next to a significant problem. Pruitt's mouth opened and closed once. Emma walked past him, giving him exactly as much space as she would give any other obstacle in a corridor, and went back to the waiting area and sat down in the same chair she'd been in before. 4 minutes later, she heard footsteps, precise, purposeful, more than one person, coming from the direction of the administrative wing, and she heard a voice she recognized as Hargrove speaking quickly and formally into a phone. And she heard a second voice she didn't recognize saying something about a preliminary detention and federal charge notation. And then she heard, from somewhere around the corner, near the nursing station, the specific, unmistakable sound of handcuffs. Emma sat in the plastic chair in the empty waiting area, with the broken vending machine light flickering in the C column, and she put her wrapped wrists on her knees and looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked up at the OR board visible through the window across the hall. Commander Rice was still listed as in surgery. Still in surgery meant still fighting. She was still sitting there when the overhead paging system activated. Not a trauma code, not an announcement, but something she hadn't heard in 3 years of working in this hospital. An emergency all-staff notification. Not for a medical crisis. For a facility security briefing. Mandatory. All administrative and security personnel. Conference room B, immediately. Emma watched 3 administrators she'd never spoken to walk past the waiting area in quick succession, all of them holding phones, all of them with the look of people who had just been told that the shape of their evening had changed in ways they were still processing. Behind them, 2 people in suits she'd never seen before were moving in the opposite direction, toward the security office, not away from it. Her phone was on the chair beside her. The screen was still cracked from whatever had happened to it during the detainment. She picked it up and saw that she had 11 missed calls, 6 from a number she didn't recognize, 3 from her nursing supervisor, 1 from her union representative, and 1 from a contact saved in her phone under a name she hadn't looked at in 3 years. She looked at that last one for a long moment. The contact name was just 2 letters and a number. An identifier from a unit designation she hadn't used since she signed her separation papers in a processing office in Fort Delray on a Thursday afternoon in November, 3 years ago, with a pen that didn't work properly and a clerk who didn't look up from his screen. She hadn't expected to see it light up her phone again. She was still looking at it when the OR board changed. The status next to Commander Rice's name shifted from in surgery to recovery, and the timestamp beside it read 11:47 p.m. And Emma let out a breath she'd been holding since somewhere around the moment she'd pressed her fingers to his lower ribs and felt what the transport team hadn't caught. He'd made it through the table. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. When she opened them, Calloway was standing in the doorway of the waiting area, and his expression, which had been controlled and military functional all night, had shifted into something slightly less composed, and he was looking at the OR board, and then he was looking at her, and he said nothing for a moment that stretched out longer than silence usually did between 2 people who barely knew each other. "He's in recovery," Emma said. "I saw," Calloway said. "The bleed was contained in the OR. Wainwright's good." "Yeah." He came into the room and sat down, not across from her but 2 seats over, in the same configuration Hargrove had used, and Emma thought distantly that there was probably a tactical reason for that. Not crowding, not imposing, giving someone who'd had a very bad evening the physical space to not feel surrounded. "The footage," Calloway said, "from the parking lot. Hargrove has already transmitted it to 3 separate federal offices. It's out of the hospital's ability to affect." Emma looked at the OR board. "Pruitt's being held pending formal charges," he said. "His partner's being interviewed. The administrator who was in the security office, Stokes, he's been put on administrative notice pending the broader inquiry." He paused. "This is going to take time. Federal processes take time. I want to be honest about that." I know how federal processes work, Emma said. Right. He looked at the floor. I also want to say, he stopped, started again. What happened tonight? Before we got here, before any of this. He gestured vaguely at the hospital around them. That's not, I'm aware that saying we're sorry doesn't. Calloway, Emma said. He stopped. I didn't call you, she said. I didn't call anyone. I had no idea any of this was going to happen tonight. I know. I've been doing my job here for 3 years, she said. Just my job, that's all. He looked at her, and something in his expression was more honest than anything he'd said with words. I know that too, he said. That's why. He stopped again and seemed to decide against whatever he'd been going to say. There's someone who wants to speak with you. Tomorrow, when you've slept. Hargrove wants to be present. There are things about your service record that are going to become part of the federal documentation, and there are decisions that are going to need to be made about what gets declassified and what doesn't, and you should have representation present for that conversation. Emma nodded. Also, Calloway said, Wainwright is requesting you specifically for the post-operative monitoring on Rice. She says, and I'm quoting, that she's not comfortable with any of the other nursing staff on nights tonight being the primary observer for a patient with this specific injury profile. Emma looked at him. She's asking, Calloway said, not ordering. You've been here since 7, and it's now, he checked his watch, 11:52. You can say no. Emma stood up. Her knees ached from the pavement and her wrists burned under the gauze, and she was running on crackers and bad coffee and the specific stubborn energy of someone who had been pushed and decided not to fall down. Tell her I'm on my way, she said. She walked to the doorway and stopped, because there was something happening at the end of the main corridor that she hadn't expected. Not another complication, not another official arrival, but something quieter and more disorienting than either of those things. The nurses at the main station had stopped what they were doing. 4 of them, all looking down the corridor in the same direction, at something Emma couldn't quite see from this angle. The unit secretary had her hand pressed flat to her desk, like she'd just caught herself from leaning forward. The overnight charge nurse, a broad-shouldered man named Ortega, who Emma had worked alongside for 2 years without ever seeing him surprised by anything, was standing very still with his phone half raised and his face doing something she'd never seen it do. Emma moved into the corridor to see what they were all looking at. 6 federal agents in blue windbreakers had come through the main hospital entrance and were walking in formation toward the administrative wing, and at the center of the formation, being walked in a manner that was technically voluntary and practically not, was Dr. Harlan Stokes. He was not in handcuffs. Not yet. But his face, in the overhead fluorescent light of the main corridor of Redwood Regional Medical Center at 11:53 on a Tuesday night, had the look of a man who understood that the shape of his next several months had just been determined by events he could no longer influence. He saw Emma. He looked away immediately. She watched him and the 6 agents walk through the corridor and through the double doors into the administrative wing, and when the doors swung shut, the sound that replaced the footsteps was the quiet of a hospital that had been holding its breath. Ortega lowered his phone. He looked at Emma across the length of the corridor. You okay? He said. It was the first time anyone who worked in this building had asked her that all night. I'm going upstairs, she said. Rice in recovery post-op. Wainwright requested me. Ortega looked at her wrists, wrapped in gauze. He looked at her scrubs, which had dried in the shape of having been soaked to the skin. He looked at her face. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded and stepped aside, and Emma walked past the nursing station toward the elevator, and behind her the unit secretary said something under her breath that Emma didn't fully hear. And whatever it was, it made Ortega exhale through his nose in the very specific way of someone who is not going to argue with what was just said. Emma pressed the elevator button and waited. The corridor behind her was quiet. The OR board showed Rice in recovery. Somewhere on the 4th floor, the man she had pulled back from the edge of something irreversible was breathing with lungs that were doing what lungs were supposed to do, because she'd been in the room to tell them what to look for before anyone else had found the words for it. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The door was almost closed when her cracked phone lit up in her hand. Not a call this time, but a message from the 2-letter 1-number contact she hadn't looked at in 3 years. And the message was 4 words. Hargrove briefed me. Stand by. The elevator doors closed. The elevator opened on the fourth floor into a different kind of quiet than the one she'd left downstairs. Post-operative recovery had its own particular atmosphere. Lower light, slower rhythms, the soft persistence of monitors set to watch rather than alarm, the specific hush of bodies doing the hard internal work of healing that no one could assist with or accelerate. Emma had always found it steadier up here than the ER. Less performance. The crisis had already happened. What remained was time and biology and the grudging patience of watching someone come back. The recovery nurse, a man named Duval, she recognized from occasional crossover shifts, looked up when she came through the door and nodded toward the bay at the far end. "Wainwright's still with him," he said. "She said you'd be coming. How's he tracking?" "Pressure's holding at 89/60. Better than I expected for the blood loss he came in with." Duval glanced at her wrists. He looked away before she could catch his expression fully, but she'd seen enough of it. "Respiratory's clean, no signs of complications from the decompression." "Pupils?" "Equal and reactive. Neuro's been checking in by phone every 20 minutes. Emma walked to the far bay. Wainwright was standing at the bedside, writing in the chart, actual handwriting on paper, which Emma had noticed she preferred over electronic entry when she was thinking through something complicated. She looked up when Emma came around the curtain and made a small gesture at the chair beside the bed that meant sit down before you fall down, which Emma appreciated even if she wasn't going to follow the instruction. Commander Rice looked smaller than he had on the trauma table. That was always the way of it. The same person who'd looked urgent and consuming when they were critical looked diminished and quiet afterward, like the crisis had been borrowing something from them and returned it with interest deducted. His color was better than she'd expected. The surgical drains were functioning. The monitors showed the steady, imperfect work of a system coming back from the edge of failure. "Splenic laceration grade 3, Wainwright said without preamble. "We repaired it. The diaphragmatic involvement was more significant than the FAST suggested. The shrapnel had tracked further than the entry wound indicated. We got it." She said the last two words in the flat tone of someone who doesn't like the word lucky, but is aware that it applies. "The lung re-expansion was clean. The decompression you did downstairs bought us the time we needed." "He's going to be okay," Emma said. It wasn't a question. "Barring infection or clotting complications, which I'm watching for aggressively." "Yes." Wainwright capped her pen. "You should have been the one who caught him in triage." Emma looked at Rice. "I wasn't available." A pause. "No," Wainwright said. "You weren't." She picked up the chart and held it against her chest and looked at Emma with the direct assessing expression that Emma had already come to recognize as her default mode. "I'm going to say something to you, and I want you to hear it as a colleague, not as an administrator, because I have had enough administrators for one night." Emma waited. "What happened to you in that parking lot was not an aberration," Wainwright said. "It was the end point of a pattern that this hospital has been tolerating for a long time. I am on record as having raised concerns about the contracted security arrangement with Ashford PD 3 separate times in the last 2 years. I was told each time that the arrangement was under review." She stopped. "It was not under review. Nothing was under review. The complaints went into somewhere, and nothing changed." "Until tonight," Emma said. "Until tonight." Wainwright looked at the monitors. "I don't know what's going to happen with the federal investigation. I know what should happen. I don't always find that the two correlate." She glanced at Emma. "I want you to know that my statement to the JAG officer included every specific date and correspondence related to my prior concerns. I want there to be a record that the warning existed." "Thank you," Emma said. It came out quieter than she intended. Wainwright seemed to understand that it was covering more than the statement, because she just nodded and went back to the chart and didn't make anything more of it. Emma pulled the chair to the bedside and sat down and checked Rice's vitals manually against what the monitor was showing. A habit she'd never been able to stop, the need to confirm what the machine said with what her own hands could verify. Pulse strong, slightly fast, but not alarmingly so. Temperature 1 degree above baseline, acceptable post-operative. The surgical site dressings clean and intact. She settled into the chair and into the specific focused alertness of post-operative monitoring and let the recovery bay's particular quiet settle around her. At 12:47, Rice opened his eyes. It happened the way waking from anesthesia usually happened. Not a clean transition, but a gradual, disorienting surfacing, the eyes opening before the cognition caught up. The body registering light and sound before the person inside it had assembled itself sufficiently to process them. He looked at the ceiling for several seconds. Then he looked at the monitors. Then he turned his head, slowly, and looked at Emma. She watched his face work through the layers of anesthesia fog. Recognition came in pieces, slower than it had in the trauma bay. "Brooks," he said. His voice was rough and slightly wrong in the way of someone who'd been intubated recently. "Easy," she said. "You're in recovery. You came through surgery." He closed his eyes, opened them again. "Where?" "Redwood Regional Medical Center, Ashford." She watched his pupils, which were responding appropriately. "You're stable. Your pressure's holding. You don't need to do anything right now." "Calloway," he said. "He's in the building. I'll tell him you're awake." Rice was quiet for a moment. She could see him taking inventory. The particular internal assessment of someone with a body that had been damaged, cataloging what they could feel and what they couldn't, and what the absence of feeling in certain areas might mean. He was doing it methodically, which told her the cognition was coming back faster than usual. "You were in the ER," he said. "Yes." "You caught something the others missed. Tension pneumothorax, classic presentation, easy to overlook when there are visible wounds demanding attention." He looked at the ceiling again. "I remember your voice," he said. "From the bay. I wasn't—" He stopped. "I wasn't fully conscious, but I remember your voice." Emma didn't say anything. "I knew you were there," he said. "Before I could see anything. I knew it was you." "You need to rest," Emma said. "The surgery was significant. Your body is going to want to sleep, and you should let it." He turned his head again. "What happened to your wrists?" She looked at the gauze. "I'll tell you later." His eyes moved to her face and stayed there with a steadiness that was incongruous with where he was and what his body had just been through. And for a moment she saw in his expression something that wasn't gratitude exactly, something more complicated and less comfortable than gratitude. The expression of a man who has processed, even through anesthesia and blood loss and surgical recovery, that something is seriously wrong with the context he's woken up into. "Tell me now," he said. So she told him. She kept it brief and factual, the same way she'd have reported a situation in the field, sequenced, no editorializing, primary events and outcomes. She watched his face as she talked. He didn't interrupt. His expression did not change dramatically, but something behind it went very still in the way that very controlled people go still when they're managing a response that they've decided not to express yet. When she finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute. "Hargrove is here," she said. "She has the footage. The federal documentation is already in process." "I know Hargrove," he said. His voice had gone to a different register than the groggy post-anesthesia one. Still rough, still limited by the intubation residue, but the tone had shifted. "She's thorough. She seems to be. She will see this through, whatever it takes." He looked at the ceiling. "I want to speak with Calloway." "In the morning?" Emma said. "It's almost 1 a.m. You came off the table 90 minutes ago. I've had worse nights." "I know you have. You still need to let your blood pressure stabilize before you have a conversation that's going to raise it." She looked at him. "I will tell Calloway you're awake and alert and requesting a briefing, and I will also tell him that as the primary monitoring nurse on your post-operative care, I'm recommending he wait until morning. What he does with that recommendation is his business." Rice looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. The involuntary response of a man who had spent decades being obeyed and has encountered, in the last few hours, a person who was going to be direct with him regardless of rank or circumstance. "Fine," he said. "Good. Brooks." She paused in the middle of writing her monitoring note. "Thank you," he said. She wrote the note. "Get some sleep, Commander." She messaged Calloway from the corridor. Rice awake, alert, requesting contact, recommending morning, and got a response in under 2 minutes that said understood, and then a second message that said Hargrove wants a 0800 meeting, building conference room B, all parties. She put the phone in her pocket and went back in to check Rice's pressure, which had climbed to 94/61, and sat down in the chair and let the quiet of the recovery bay settle back into place. She did not sleep. She'd slept in worse conditions and she could have managed it, but something in the texture of the night kept her at a low-level alertness she couldn't entirely turn off. The phone message from the two-letter one-number contact sat in the back of her mind like a splinter. Small and specific and refusing to be ignored. Stand by. She hadn't answered it. She wasn't sure yet what answering it would mean. At 2:15, Duval knocked on the bay curtain and leaned in. "Someone downstairs asking for you," he said. "Union rep. Says she's been here since 11 and they wouldn't let her up before." Emma went down. The union representative was a woman named Gail Marsh, mid-50s, gray locks, wearing a fleece jacket over dress pants with the look of someone who had been pulled from something else and come anyway without changing. She was standing in the main lobby with a leather folio and the specific contained energy of a person who has been doing this long enough to know how to wait without wasting the wait. She looked at Emma's wrists. She looked at her scrubs. She looked at her face. "I tried to get here faster," she said. "I know," Emma said. "It's fine." "It is not fine," Marsh said, and her voice was very level and very clear. "None of what happened tonight is fine, and I want to be precise about that on the record because there is going to be a tendency, there is always a tendency, for the institution to try to reframe events once the immediate crisis has passed, and I will not allow that framing to take hold." "Okay," Emma said. "I need you to walk me through everything," Marsh said, "in sequence, starting from when you left the nursing floor at the end of your shift. I'm going to record it with your permission, and I'm going to have a full written account to you by morning." Emma walked her through it. It took 23 minutes. Marsh asked 7 clarifying questions throughout and did not react to any of it with visible emotion, which Emma found more reassuring than sympathy would have been. She was building something, a documented record, a timeline, a structure that would be difficult to argue against later. Emma recognized the work because she'd done a version of it herself, in different contexts, for different purposes. When Emma finished, Marsh closed her folio. "The federal process is going to move faster than a typical internal investigation," she said. "JAG involvement accelerates certain things, but I want a parallel union grievance on record independent of the federal timeline, because federal investigations occasionally produce accountability in ways that don't extend fully to the employment protections we're entitled to pursue. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "You want multiple tracks," Emma said. "I want multiple tracks," Marsh confirmed. "And I want you to get at least a few hours of sleep before the 8 o'clock meeting, which you are not obligated to attend without representation." "I'll be attending," Emma said. "I know," Marsh said. "So will I." The 8 o'clock meeting had been changed by 7:45. The new location was a larger room, a full conference space on the administrative wing's second floor, the kind with a projector screen and a long table that seated 16. Emma arrived at 5 minutes to 8 and found that the room already had 11 people in it, which was 11 more than she'd expected. Hargrove was at the head of the table with 2 people Emma didn't recognize, both in suits, both with the particular posture of federal attorneys. Calloway was against the wall, standing, in the way of people who don't sit down in formal meetings when they can avoid it. Marsh was at the table with her folio. Wainwright was there, which Emma hadn't expected, with a folder of her own. There were 3 other people on Hargrove's side of the table that Emma couldn't immediately identify, and there was a large monitor at the far end of the room that was currently showing a paused image. Emma recognized the image. It was the exterior camera angle from the corner of the building, the secondary coverage angle. The timestamp in the corner read 19:14:38. The image showed the staff exit door, the wet pavement, and 2 figures, one of whom was her. Marsh touched her elbow. Not urgently, just a small signal. Emma sat down next to her. Hargrove looked at the room. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to note for the record that this meeting has been convened under federal administrative authority pursuant to the ongoing investigation into events at this facility. All statements made in this room are subject to that record. If anyone present has concerns about proceeding without personal legal counsel, this is the time to raise them." No one raised anything. "Good," Hargrove said. She nodded at one of the people Emma didn't know, who clicked something on a laptop, and the image on the monitor began to move. Emma had known the footage existed. She had known, in the abstract, that it documented what she'd said. It documented. Knowing that and watching it were 2 different experiences, and she found that she was not as prepared for the latter as she'd thought. The footage was clear. The secondary camera angle caught almost everything: the exit door opening, the two security guards, Pruitt arriving from the parking lot side, the conversation she couldn't hear but could reconstruct from the body language, the bag being pulled from her shoulder, the movement toward the door, her own mouth clearly forming the words she'd repeated 3 times for the record, and then the pavement, and then Pruitt's hand, and then her knees. The room was very quiet. Hargrove let the footage run through the handcuffing, and then she stopped it. "This is camera 2, she said. Camera 1, from the main entrance angle, captures the interior of the security office through the lobby glass. We have footage of Officer Pruitt physically blocking the recording camera in the security office. We have footage of the illegal search of Ms. Brooks' personal belongings. We have footage of Dr. Stokes entering the security office and leaving without taking any action to address the situation." She looked at the room in a way that was not aggressive but was thorough. "The preliminary federal charge notation issued last night covers Officer Pruitt and Officer Gentry for civil rights violations under federal statute. A separate notation has been issued for obstruction of justice regarding the prior internal affairs complaints that were not processed." She looked at the 2 people on her left. "The hospital's administrative liability is being assessed separately and will be addressed through a parallel track." Wainwright, across the table, was looking at the paused screen. "I want to move now," Hargrove said, "to a matter that was not anticipated when this investigation opened." She looked at Emma. "Ms. Brooks, with your permission, I want to enter your service record into the federal documentation." Emma looked at her. "Which parts?" "The parts that are relevant to what happened here," Hargrove said. "Your classification level, your unit attachment history, your commendations, not the operational specifics of the sealed deployments." "And the purpose?" "To establish the full context of what was done to a person whose service to this country is documented and significant." Hargrove's voice stayed professional, but something underneath it was not entirely detached. "And to make clear, on a federal record, the magnitude of what Officer Pruitt and this administration treated as inconsequential." Emma was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "You have my permission." Hargrove nodded. One of the federal attorneys began typing. "There's a second matter," Calloway said from the wall. He looked at Emma when he said it, which she noted. "Commander Rice has requested to make a formal statement. He was briefed this morning. He's asked to do it in this room, this morning, rather than wait." Emma turned to look at him. "He's 18 hours post-op." "He's aware of that," Calloway said. "He's also aware that it's his choice." She looked at Hargrove, who said, "His physician cleared him for a limited seated participation." Emma thought about the man she'd left sleeping in the recovery bay at 6 a.m. when Duval had told her to go get ready for the meeting. She thought about his face when he'd looked at her gauze-wrapped wrists and asked what happened. "All right," she said. Calloway left the room. He came back 4 minutes later, and Rice came in behind him in a wheelchair pushed by Duval, wearing a hospital gown under a blanket with an IV still in his left arm, and the color of someone who was running on sheer force of professional habit rather than physical recovery. But his eyes were clear and his back was straight, and when he came to the head of the table, Hargrove moved to give him space, and he looked around the room with the careful assessment of a man who has walked into many rooms and made rapid decisions about all of them. He looked at Emma last. "I'll keep this brief," he said. His voice was rough but carried. "Because I've been told I have approximately 15 minutes before my post-operative nurse removes me from this room herself." There was a small, involuntary sound from Wainwright's side of the table. "My name is Commander Garrett Rice, and my service record will be provided to this investigation upon my formal authorization, which I'm giving now." He looked at Hargrove. "I have a statement regarding Nurse Emma Brooks." Hargrove nodded. The federal attorney's fingers paused over the keyboard, then resumed. Rice looked at the table for a moment, and Emma thought she saw something in his expression that wasn't the prepared phrasing of a formal statement, something more ragged and immediate than that. "In a location I won't name, during an operation I can't describe, Emma Brooks kept 6 members of my team alive under conditions that had already exceeded the training parameters for every medical professional present." He stopped. "She worked for 11 hours without relief, without sufficient supplies, with incoming contact ongoing for the first 4 of those 11 hours. He looked up. 3 of the 6 people she kept alive that night have since gone on to serve additional tours. One of them is in this city right now, because he came with me on the transport last night. and is currently sitting in a hotel 3 blocks from here, wondering what's happening in this room. The room was very quiet. What was done to her last night in the parking lot of this hospital, Rice said, was done to someone who earned, through actions I personally witnessed, more institutional respect and professional courtesy than anyone in that parking lot had the capacity to understand. His voice had not risen. It was, if anything, quieter than when he'd started. I want that on the record, not because it changes what was wrong about what happened. It was wrong regardless, and I want to be clear that I understand that, but because the record should be complete. He looked at Emma across the table. She looked back at him. Her jaw was tight. There were things happening in her chest that she was managing with the same skill she brought to everything else that required management, which was to say, imperfectly and with visible effort. "Thank you, Commander," Hargrove said quietly. "That statement is on the record." Rice nodded. He looked at Calloway, and something passed between them that Emma didn't try to decode. Then the door opened. It was one of the federal attorneys who'd been working outside the room, and she came in fast, not running, but with the compressed urgency of someone who has just received information that changes the shape of the next 30 minutes. She leaned down to Hargrove and said something close to her ear, and Hargrove's expression shifted in a way Emma couldn't entirely read. Not alarm, but a controlled alertness that suggested something had happened that was significant and not expected. Hargrove looked up at the room. "There's been a development," she said. Overnight, 2 officers from the Ashford PD Internal Affairs Division contacted federal investigators independently. They are alleging that the 3 prior complaints against Officer Pruitt, the 2 from nursing staff and the family complaint, were not lost in process. She paused. They were deliberately suppressed by a named superior officer. The room absorbed that. Additionally, Hargrove said, Officer Gentry, Pruitt's partner last night, has provided a voluntary statement in the last hour. He states that prior to last night's incident, Pruitt was informed by a hospital administrator that a specific nurse on the evening shift had been, and I'm quoting the statement, flagged for removal, and that the medication complaint was filed as a mechanism to achieve that removal. Emma felt something cold and precise move through her. "The complaint wasn't random," Marsh said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Hargrove said. "It appears it was not." She looked at Emma. "We're working to establish who filed it and at whose direction. We expect to have that information within the hour." Emma looked at the table. She looked at the paused footage on the monitor. Her own figure, caught mid-fall on rain-slicked pavement, outside a building where she had worked for 3 years without a single complaint against her. Wainwright said, quietly and with considerable precision, something that wasn't appropriate for a formal federal proceeding, and that no one in the room appeared to disagree with. "Who?" Emma said. Her voice was very flat. "Who flagged me?" Hargrove looked at her with an expression that was careful and not quite apologetic. "We're confirming the chain. What I can tell you is that the initial flag appears to have originated from within nursing administration." "Who in nursing administration?" Emma said. "Emma?" Marsh started. "I have a right to know who," Emma said, and she kept her voice at exactly the same temperature it had been all morning, which was the temperature of something very controlled under pressure and aware of itself. Hargrove held her gaze. "We believe it was your direct supervisor," she said. The name hit her harder than the pavement had. The name hit her harder than the pavement had. Not because it was a surprise, exactly. In the 30 seconds between Hargrove saying nursing administration and saying the rest of it, some part of Emma's mind had already been assembling the pieces. The specific quality of the complaint, the timing, the fact that someone in the building had known which nurse was finishing her shift at 7 and which exit she'd use and which security arrangement would be in place to receive her. That kind of operational knowledge didn't come from outside. It came from someone who knew the floor schedule, the staffing rotation, the layout of the building. It came from someone with access. Her nursing supervisor was a woman named Lorraine Vass, 58 years old, 22 years at Redwood Regional, the same 22 years that Emma's performance evaluations had apparently praised with language Vass herself had written and submitted. The woman who had told Emma, 18 months ago during her annual review, that she was the strongest clinical nurse on the floor. The woman who had twice recommended her for a senior charge position that Emma had twice declined because she preferred to stay at the bedside, and Vass had seemed to respect that. Emma sat with that for a moment. The specific disorientation of finding that a person you'd read as fundamentally decent had been doing something else entirely behind the surface you could see. "You said you believe," Emma said. Her voice came out steady. "You're still confirming." "The chain of communication is being traced," Hargrove said. "What Gentry's statement establishes is that Pruitt was told about the flag and told about the complaint mechanism before he arrived at the hospital last night. What it doesn't yet establish with documentary evidence is who in nursing administration initiated the contact with Pruitt's superior officer." She paused. "But the directional indicators are strong." "What would be the motive?" Marsh said. She was in full professional mode now, folio open, pen moving. "That's what we're working to establish," Hargrove said. Emma was quiet. She was thinking about 22 years. She was thinking about the way Vass had looked at her last week in the break room, but nothing unusual, nothing she could pin to this, and about the specific relief she'd felt early in her time at Redwood Regional, when she realized she had a supervisor who saw her competence without needing to understand its origins. She had never told Vass about the military. Nobody at the hospital knew, except Ferris now, and the conference room full of people in front of her, and the administrative record that Hargrove was building in real time. The competence, she realized, was probably the problem. Not the military. Just the competence itself. And whatever that competence represented to someone who'd been the most capable person in a room for 22 years and had watched a 31-year-old arrive and quietly rearrange that equation. It was a small and human thing to do something catastrophically wrong for. The smallness of it didn't make her less angry. If anything, it made her more. "I want to know when you confirm it," Emma said. "You'll know," Hargrove said. Rice, who had been quiet since his statement, looked at Emma across the table. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She looked back at him and gave a very small nod that meant, "I'm fine," which was approximately 60% true, and they both knew it, and he accepted it without pushing. Calloway looked at his watch. The 8 o'clock press briefing at Ashford PD was postponed this morning pending the federal notification. They can't postpone it indefinitely. By noon, this is going to be in the local news cycle, whether the department wants it there or not. "It's already in the local news cycle," one of Hargrove's attorneys said. She turned her laptop around. A local Ashford news site had a headline that read, "Federal Agents at Redwood Regional, Sources Cited Officer Misconduct," and a story that was thin on specifics, but accurate enough in outline to indicate that someone who'd been in the building last night had talked to a reporter. Emma looked at the headline. She had no particular feelings about it. The news existed or it didn't. What mattered was what the federal record said, not what a website said. And the federal record was being assembled in this room right now with enough documentation to make it durable. "Duvall is going to want to take Commander Rice back upstairs," Emma said. She looked at Rice. "You've been in this chair for 40 minutes. He didn't argue, which told her more about how he was actually feeling than any monitor reading would have. She stood up and signaled Duvall, who came in from the corridor where he'd been waiting with the wheelchair. Rice looked at Emma as Duvall positioned the chair. "What happens to you now?" he said. "Not a question exactly. Same thing that was always going to happen," she said. "I go back to work." He studied her. "And the 8 o'clock offer?" She went still. "Calloway told me," Rice said, "last night when he came up. The contact message you got." He looked at her carefully. "I want you to know it has nothing to do with last night. It's been in process for 6 weeks. The timing is unfortunate." Emma looked at Calloway, who was studying the wall with great interest. "We can discuss it later," she said. "We can," Rice said. "I'm not going anywhere fast." Duvall wheeled him out. The room watched him go with the particular quiet of people who have been in the presence of someone with a specific kind of weight and are adjusting to the absence of it. The confirmation came at 9:47. Hargrove's attorney came back into the room. The meeting had broken into smaller working groups after Rice left, with Marsh working through the union documentation at one end of the table and the federal attorneys pulling records at the other. And she put a printed document in front of Hargrove and said 3 words that Emma heard from across the room. "We have it." Hargrove read the document. She read it again. Then she looked at Emma. "The hospital's internal email system," she said. "The federal preservation letter locked the server at 11:48 last night. At 11:51, 3 minutes later, an account registered to Lorraine Vass attempted to delete a thread of internal messages." She set the document down. The deletion failed because the preservation lock was already in place. The messages were recovered intact this morning. The room was very quiet. What do they say? Marsh said. The first message is dated 11 days ago, Hargrove said. It's from Vass to Dr. Stokes. The subject line is staffing concerns. She looked at the document. In it, Vass describes what she calls an untenable situation with a senior nurse whose, I'm quoting, clinical overreach is creating friction with attending physicians and whose background raises questions that administration should be aware of. Emma sat with that phrasing for a moment. Clinical overreach. The thing she'd done wrong, in Lorraine Vass's assessment, was being good at the job. Stokes responds the same day, Hargrove continued. He asks what kind of background. Vass responds and says she doesn't know specifics, but that the nurse has knowledge and procedural instincts that are, and this is the quote, inconsistent with her stated history. She says she's looked at the personnel file and it doesn't account for what she observes on the floor. Hargrove paused. She says she finds it concerning and wants to address it before it becomes a liability. She was threatened, Wainwright said. Her voice was flat. By competence. The exchange continues over 9 days, Hargrove said. Stokes and Vass discuss options. The contracted security arrangement comes up in the 7th message. Pruitt is referenced by name in the 8th message, in the context of Stokes describing him as, quote, cooperative with hospital administration on sensitive personnel matters in the past. Emma looked at the table. The medication complaint was drafted in the 9th message, Hargrove said. Vass wrote it. Stokes reviewed it. It was submitted through a third-party anonymous reporting system to obscure the origin, but the language of the complaint matches the language of Vass's draft in the email chain to a degree that removes any ambiguity. There was a long silence. They planned it, Marsh said. She said it not as outrage, but as documentation, the precise, necessary recording of what had been established. Over 9 days, Hargrove said. Yes. Emma looked up at the monitor, which was still showing the paused exterior camera footage from last night. Her figure, mid-fall. The rain on the pavement. The clear, recorded, permanent image of something that had been planned 9 days in advance by people who had worked alongside her, evaluated her, told her she was excellent, and then decided she was too much of something they couldn't name to be allowed to stay. She thought about Vass writing her annual review. The specific language, among the best I've seen in 22 years of hospital management, and writing, simultaneously, to Stokes. Her background raises questions. She had been 2 things to Vass at the same time, the best and the unacceptable, and Vass had apparently spent some portion of her working days holding both of those assessments and eventually decided to resolve the tension by removing the source of it. Emma was not going to cry in a federal conference room. That was simply not going to happen. But she was aware of something in her chest that was looking for somewhere to go, and she directed it, with the same precision she directed everything, into the next thing that needed to be done. What are the charges? She said. For Vass and Stokes jointly, conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal statute, filing a false complaint with intent to harm, obstruction. The attempted deletion this morning adds an obstruction count. For Stokes individually, given his presence in the security office and his failure to intervene, additional charges related to facilitation are being assessed. Hargrove looked at her. These are federal charges, Ms. Brooks. They carry significant exposure. And Pruitt? Pruitt's charges from last night stand. The new material from Gentry's statement and the email chain strengthens them considerably. Hargrove looked at the document again. The reference in the emails to Pruitt being cooperative with hospital administration on sensitive personnel matters in the past is being investigated as a separate line. We believe last night was not his first engagement in this type of arrangement. Emma thought about the 3 prior complaints, the 2 nurses who'd stopped pursuing it after follow-up meetings with department supervisors. She thought about what those meetings might have looked like, what was said, what was implied. When do you move on Vass? Emma said. This morning, Hargrove said, depending on whether she's in the building. Wasyang, she was in the building. Emma found this out not from Hargrove, but from Ortega, who texted her at 10:12 with the message, Vass is on the floor. She came in at her regular time. Does not appear to know what's happening. And then, a minute later, people are talking. Word is getting around. It's not quiet up here. Emma read both messages and then put her phone face down on the conference room table and thought about that for a moment. Lorraine Vass had come in at her regular time, had walked through the hospital entrance, had gone to the nursing floor, was presumably doing the things she did every morning, reviewing the overnight logs, checking the staffing board, having her coffee, being the 22-year institutional fixture that she had always been. Not knowing that 9 floors below her, in a federal conference room, a document existed with her name on it, and 9 days of emails, and an attempted deletion that had failed by 3 minutes. "I need to ask you something," Emma said to Hargrove. Hargrove looked at her. "When you move on her, is it going to happen on the floor?" Hargrove studied her. "The plan is to have her brought to administrative HR for an interview under the guise of a routine request. The detention would happen there." "In the HR office," Emma said, "not on the nursing floor." "That's the current plan." Emma nodded slowly. She wasn't sure what she felt about it. Some part of her, the part that had been on its knees on wet pavement while Pruitt's partner laughed, wanted it to be public. Wanted Vass to be walked past the nurses' station in front of the people who'd worked for her. Wanted the same exposure that Emma had been given, involuntarily, when she'd been walked through the lobby in front of the staff who'd looked through the glass and kept walking. But that part of her was not the part she made decisions from. The part she made decisions from knew that public humiliation wasn't justice. It was satisfaction, and those were different things, and she'd learned a long time ago to be careful about mistaking one for the other. "Okay," she said. "There's something else I want you to consider," Hargrove said. She looked at the table briefly, then back at Emma. "You have no obligation to be in this building when it happens. You've been here since before 7 p.m. yesterday. You are entitled to leave." "I know," Emma said. "But you're not going to." "No," Emma said. Hargrove almost said something else. Then she didn't. The move on Vass happened at 11:20. Emma wasn't in the room for it. She was on the 4th floor, in Commander Rice's recovery bay, doing the 10 o'clock monitoring check that she'd agreed to cover because Duval had a mandatory department meeting, and the agency nurse who'd been scheduled for the bay didn't have the post-operative trauma experience the case required. She was checking Rice's drain output, which was decreasing appropriately, a good sign, when her phone buzzed with a message from Marsh. "Vass is in custody. HR office. Formal charges being read now." She recorded the drain output in the chart and moved on to the next set of vitals. Rice was awake. He'd been drifting in and out since early morning, but the anesthesia fog had mostly cleared and what remained was the ordinary exhaustion of a body doing significant repair work. He watched her move through the monitoring checks with the patient, focused attention of someone who had nothing else to do and was directing their available energy toward observation. "It happened," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "How are you doing?" She wrote the vitals in the chart. "I don't know yet. I'll figure that out later." "That's a very you answer," he said. She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means you've been doing the next thing since I met you," he said. "The thing right in front of you. You don't stop and take stock. You move to the next problem." "The next problem usually needs moving to." "Yeah," he said, "but eventually there isn't a next problem, and you have to decide what to do with the space." Emma capped the pen. She looked at the monitors. She looked at the window where the morning had come in gray and clearing, the rain finally done, the sky doing the tentative work of becoming something else. "What's the offer?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Combat Trauma Consultation Unit, Federal Medical Advisory Board. We're building a formal integration structure between civilian ER medicine and military trauma protocols, a knowledge transfer program, so that what people like you learned in places we can't talk about doesn't get lost when you come home." He paused. "We need people who've done both, who understand both systems and can translate between them. You're not the only one, but you're—" He stopped. "I'm what?" she said. "You're the one I trust to say what's actually broken instead of what's politically convenient," he said. "There aren't as many of those as you'd think." Emma looked at the window. "It's not full-time," he said. "It's structured so you can maintain civilian practice. The hospital position would stay open. That part is up to you and whatever happens with Redwood Regional's administration going forward, which is going to look different in 6 months than it looks today." He shifted in the bed and made a small sound that told her the movement had cost him something. "I'm not asking for an answer today." "Good," she said, "because I don't have one." She left the bay and walked to the corridor window that looked out over Ashford's mid-morning skyline, the water tower, the low commercial blocks, the distant line of hills that had been invisible behind last night's rain. Her phone had 24 messages she hadn't read. She looked at the phone, and then she put it back in her pocket and looked at the window instead. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. It was Ortega. He looked like he'd been on shift for too long, which he had, and he was holding 2 cups of coffee that were clearly from somewhere better than the break room machine, which meant he'd gone out to the street-level cafe before coming up. He held one out. She took it. They stood at the window together for a moment without saying anything. "Vas?" he said. "Yes." "I've worked with her for 11 years, he said. He didn't add anything to that. "I know," Emma said. "She's a good manager," he said. That's what I can't—" He stopped. "She runs a tight floor. She knows every protocol. She's covered staff during short shifts for 20 years. He was quiet. "And she did what she did." "People contain things," Emma said. It was the truest thing she knew how to say about it. Ortega drank his coffee. "Ferris wants to talk to you. About last night. I think he's embarrassed." "He shouldn't be. He was managing a presentation he hadn't been trained for." "He knows. He still wants to talk." Ortega looked at the window. "A lot of people want to talk to you." "I'm aware." "You don't have to do any of it today." Emma drank the coffee, which was hot and considerably better than the break rooms, and thought about that. "I know," she said. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from Hargrove. "Secondary development. Come to conference room B when you can. Not urgent, but significant." She looked at the word significant and finished her coffee. The secondary development was Officer Gentry. Not the statement he'd already given, a new one, an addendum, provided voluntarily at 10:58 with his attorney present, and the addendum contained something that Hargrove had not expected, and that the Ashford PD had very clearly not expected either, based on the expression of the department's legal representative, who was now sitting at the far end of the conference table looking like a man who has just discovered that the floor is not where he thought it was. Gentry had provided names, not just Pruitt's, not just the prior complaints, names of 3 other Ashford PD officers who had participated in similar arrangements with Redwood Regional's administration over a period of, Gentry believed, based on what he'd heard in the department, approximately 4 years. Arrangements in which the contracted hospital security role had been used, on at least 5 documented occasions, to remove or pressure employees that hospital administration had wanted removed without going through formal HR process. 5 occasions. 4 years. Emma was not the first. She was the first where the patient who arrived that night happened to be a federal officer with a JAG colonel already in the air. Hargrove was reading from the printed addendum. Her voice was completely level in the way of someone delivering information that has long since passed through their own emotional processing and come out the other side as pure material for action. Gentry states he was recruited into the arrangement by Pruitt approximately 8 months after joining the department, she said. He states that he understood the arrangement as, quote, part of how the hospital contract worked, like an unwritten term. He states that he participated twice prior to last night, and that on both prior occasions the target individual was a female hospital employee. She looked up. Both of those individuals are being contacted this morning by federal investigators. Emma thought about the 2 nurses from the prior complaints, the ones who'd stopped pursuing it after follow-up meetings with supervisors. They stopped because they were told to stop, she said. We believe so, Hargrove said. We're working to establish what was said in those meetings. They were told what would happen if they didn't, Emma said. Not a question. The logic of it was self-completing. And then nothing happened to Pruitt because he was protected by the arrangement, and the arrangement was protected by the fact that everyone participating in it had something to lose if it came out. That's the structure we're working to document, Hargrove said. Marsh was writing steadily. The federal attorney across from her was doing the same. The Ashford PD legal representative was looking at the table with the expression of a man assembling a private list of everyone who was going to receive a very difficult phone call in the next 24 hours. What are we looking at in terms of the expanded investigation? Marsh said. The scope has widened, Hargrove said. What began as a civil rights violation against a single individual has opened into a documented pattern of institutional corruption involving a law enforcement agency and a medical facility. She looked at her attorney. "We'll be requesting additional investigative resources this afternoon." Emma looked at the window at the far end of the conference room. The sky was clearing faster now, the gray burning off in patches. She was thinking about the wait of 4 years. 5 occasions. 2 nurses who'd stopped pursuing complaints that deserved to be heard. The institutional silence that had grown up around all of it, maintained by the specific gravity of accumulated compromise. Each person who knew something and said nothing because they had something to lose. Each suppressed complaint making the next suppression slightly easier. The whole structure held together by the ordinary human calculation of what it cost to speak against something that had powerful people invested in its continuation. Emma had not been removed before the calculation could be made on her behalf. She'd been removed, or the attempt had been made, because someone had done that calculation and found her expendable. What they hadn't calculated for was Commander Rice and Calloway and Hargrove already in the air. Luck, she thought, and the absence of luck for the women who'd come before. The thought sat in her chest like something with weight. "I want to ask about the 2 prior nurses," she said. "The ones Gentry mentioned. What happens to their cases now?" "They become part of this investigation," Hargrove said. "Their prior complaints will be formally reopened. If the suppression is documented, and we believe it will be, there are remedies available to them." "What kind of remedies?" "Civil and federal." Hargrove looked at her directly. "Ms. Brooks, I want to be clear that what you did by staying in this building last night, by giving your statement, by permitting us to use your service record, what that created was a documented federal record that these women's cases can now attach to. Their complaints existed in a drawer somewhere. Your situation opened the drawer." Emma looked at the table. "I wasn't trying to open anything," she said. "I was trying to go home." "I know," Hargrove said. "That's how most of these things start." At 12:38, Dr. Harlan Stokes was escorted from the hospital by 2 federal agents through the main administrative entrance on the building's east side. Emma was not watching from the lobby. She was upstairs on the 4th floor, standing at the nursing station writing a handoff note for Rice's afternoon monitoring team, when Ortega texted her, "Stokes, east entrance, it's done." She finished the handoff note. She checked the notation was complete and legible. She dated it and signed it. At 12:41, the hospital-wide page system activated, and the interim chief of medicine, a woman named Dr. Priya Okafor, who Emma knew by reputation and had never directly worked with, announced a mandatory all-staff communication that would be delivered via department heads at 1 p.m. Okafor's voice on the page was professionally composed and contained the particular deliberate steadiness of someone who understands that the tone of what they say is carrying as much information as the content. At 12:44, Emma's phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't have saved. The message said, "This is Renata Solis. I was a nurse at Redwood Regional. I left 14 months ago. I heard what happened. Investigators called me this morning. I need to talk to someone who understands what it was like. Can I call you?" Emma read the message twice. She thought, 14 months ago. The timing aligned with the second prior complaint Gentry had referenced. She thought about someone leaving a job they'd presumably chosen, in a building they'd presumably known well, because something had happened there that was easier to leave than fight, and the calculation had come down to her dignity or her energy, and she'd spent her energy on surviving the leaving instead. Emma typed, "Yes, call whenever you're ready." She put the phone in her pocket and walked to the window at the end of the 4th floor corridor and looked out at Ashford under a sky that was almost entirely clear now. The morning's gray finally resolved into something colder and more honest. She was still standing there when she heard the elevator open behind her, and footsteps, and then Calloway's voice saying her name. And when she turned, his expression was not the contained professional expression he'd maintained through 20 hours of controlled crisis, but something different, something with more edges. "What?" she said. "There's something you need to see," he said, "in the security office." She followed him. The security office was not the same room she'd been held in last night. Same location, but it had been turned into a working space for the federal investigators, with laptops and boxes of printed records, and 2 agents at the bolted-down table who looked up when Emma came in and then looked back at their work. On the laptop screen facing the door was a paused video feed, not the exterior camera from last night. Something else. An interior angle she didn't recognize. Calloway looked at the agent nearest the laptop. The agent reached over and pressed play. The footage was from a camera inside the security office, a different angle than the main camera, which Pruitt had stood in front of last night. A secondary angle aimed at the far corner that captured the room from a different vector. Emma hadn't seen it. Pruitt apparently hadn't seen it either, or hadn't known about it. The footage showed last night. It showed the security office. It showed Pruitt's back, partially blocking the main camera as she'd noted. But from this angle, around his left side, it showed the table. And on the table, beside her upended bag and the torn granola bar wrapper and her cracked phone, it showed Pruitt's hand. And what Pruitt's hand was doing was removing something from his jacket pocket and placing it, carefully and deliberately, on the table next to her belongings. The something was a small prescription bottle. Emma stared at the screen. The agent paused it again. "The bottle was logged as evidence this morning," she said. "Contents are consistent with controlled substances. The prescription label is from the hospital dispensary system." She looked at Emma. "The label has been traced. It was printed using a dispensary access code." Emma was very still. "Whose code?" she said. The agent looked at Calloway. Calloway looked at Emma. "Yours," he said. The prescription bottle sat in evidence packaging on the corner of the table, and Emma looked at it with the specific, cold clarity of someone who has just understood the full shape of something that had previously only been partially visible. Not just a complaint, not just an illegal search, not just a parking lot and a pair of handcuffs too tight. A plant, a fabricated chain of evidence built in advance, designed to be found. The complaint was the opening move. The search was the mechanism. The bottle, her access code on the label, controlled substances in the container, was supposed to be the closing argument, the thing that made everything else irreversible, the thing that turned a false complaint into a documented criminal act and made the removal not just administrative but permanent. 9 days of planning. An access code pulled from the dispensary system by someone with administrative reach into hospital records. A bottle staged on a table in a room that Pruitt had believed was recording only from one angle. She looked at the secondary camera in the corner of the security office. The one Pruitt hadn't known about. The one that had been there, silent and unremarkable and completely functional the entire time. "Who else has seen this footage?" she said. "Hargrove," Calloway said. "The 2 agents in this room, you." "The dispensary access code, how was it obtained?" The agent at the laptop said, "The dispensary system logs every access. Your code was used at 11:43 p.m. last Tuesday to query the controlled substance inventory. The query was made from a terminal in the nursing supervisor's administrative office." Emma turned that over. Last Tuesday, 6 days before the complaint was filed, someone sitting at Lorraine Vass's terminal, using Emma's dispensary credentials, pulling an inventory query to establish a digital footprint, to create the appearance of access, of interest, of something that could later be described as a pattern if anyone went looking. "Can you tell if it was Vass who ran the query or someone else using her terminal?" Emma said. "We're pulling the building's interior camera footage for that corridor for that time. We'll have an answer by end of day." The agent looked at her steadily. "The important thing to understand is that the secondary camera footage makes the framing attempt a documented fact, regardless of what the dispensary logs show." Pruitt placed that bottle. "It's on video." Emma looked at the bottle in its evidence bag. Someone had spent 9 days building something they believed was solid. They had used her name, her credentials, her professional record as the raw material for a frame. They had been careful and methodical about it. They had thought it through, and then Pruitt had staged the physical evidence in a room with 2 cameras instead of 1, and the whole structure had come apart at the point where they'd believed it was most secure. "Add it to the federal record," she said. "All of it." The 1 p.m. all-staff communication happened on schedule. Emma was not in a department meeting when it happened. She was in the 4th floor corridor outside Rice's recovery bay, sitting on a bench that was there for family members and was deeply uncomfortable in the way of all hospital furniture that was designed to discourage extended sitting, reading through the message thread with Renata Solis, who had called at 12:50 and talked for 22 minutes. Solis was 34. She had been a charge nurse on the surgical floor. She had filed her complaint 14 months ago after Pruitt, during a contracted security shift, had followed her to her car on 3 separate occasions, and on the third occasion had put his hand on her arm in a way that was not ambiguous about what it was. She had reported it to Vass. Vass had told her the matter would be handled internally. 3 weeks later, Solis had been informed that her position was being restructured and her role eliminated, effective in 30 days. "I knew what it was," Solis had said on the phone. Her voice was calm in the particular way of someone who has had 14 months to achieve a certain equilibrium with an injustice. "I knew exactly what it was. But I had a lease, and I just started paying off my school loans, and they told me they'd contest unemployment if I claimed wrongful termination, and I—" She'd stopped. "I calculated the cost, and I decided I couldn't afford to be right." Emma had listened without interrupting. "What I want to know," Solis had said, "is whether what you're building, the federal record, all of it, is whether it will hold, whether it will actually hold, or whether in 6 months there will be settlements and confidentiality clauses, and everyone will move on, and what happened to both of us will be a footnote somewhere. I can't promise you what the process produces," Emma had said. "I can tell you that what exists on that federal record right now is thorough and documented and comes with video. I can tell you that Hargrove is the kind of person who does not consider the job done until the job is done." She had paused. "And I can tell you that the investigator working your case has your prior complaint, which means it goes into the record under your name, not as an anonymous allegation. You are on that record as a person." There had been a silence on the line. "Okay," Solis had finally said. "Okay. That matters." Emma was sitting with that conversation still in her chest when the overhead page delivered Okafor's all-staff communication. Brief and factual, effective immediately. The contracted security arrangement with Ashford PD was suspended pending federal investigation. Interim security measures were in place. All staff with information relevant to the investigation were encouraged to contact the federal hotline number being posted to all department boards. The hospital's board of directors had convened an emergency session and would be issuing a statement by end of business. No mention of Stokes, no mention of Vass, no mention of what had happened in a parking lot 17 hours ago. But the corridors had ears, and the corridors had been talking since before midnight. And by the time the 1 p.m. page finished, there was not a person in Redwood Regional Medical Center who did not know the shape of what had happened, even if they didn't know every detail. Ortega texted, "Floor is quiet, the kind of quiet that means everyone is processing. Ferris is in his office with the door closed. Petra is at the station, and she's been crying a little. She won't admit it." Emma typed back, "Tell Petra I'm okay." Ortega, "She knows. She's not crying about you. She's crying because she didn't say anything last night when they walked you out." Emma sat with that for a moment. "Tell her that's not on her," she typed, "and mean it when you tell her." Bob. Hargrove came to find her at 2:15. She sat down on the bench without ceremony, looked at the wall across from them, and said, "The dispensary camera footage confirms it was Vass at the terminal. The query was run from her office at 11:43 p.m. on a night she was documented as working a late administrative shift." She looked at Emma. "She is being charged with evidence fabrication and conspiracy to commit civil rights violations in addition to the original charges. The fabrication charge carries a federal sentencing range that is significantly more serious than what we were looking at this morning." Emma looked at the opposite wall. "She tried to delete the emails at 11:51 last night," Emma said. 3 minutes after the preservation lock. Yes, she knew. When the federal agents came into the building, she knew the emails existed and tried to destroy them. Yes. And the bottle was already in Pruitt's pocket when he arrived, Emma said. Which means the physical plant was planned for last night specifically. They weren't just flagging me for future removal. They'd set a specific date. "That's our read," Hargrove said. "We believe the timeline was accelerated. Something triggered a decision to move last night rather than continue building the paper trail. We're looking at whether there was a specific event that prompted it." Emma thought about the prior week. Her shifts, her patient interactions, nothing unusual. She thought about the senior charge position Vass had twice offered her, the one she'd twice declined. "She offered me a promotion 3 weeks ago," Emma said. "Senior charge nurse. I turned it down again." Hargrove looked at her. "I think she read the second refusal differently than the first," Emma said. "I think she decided I wasn't going to be managed." She paused. "I think she decided I was eventually going to become something she couldn't predict, and she wanted to resolve it before that happened." "That's consistent with the email language," Hargrove said. "The phrase she used? Liability. She used it twice. Emma breathed out through her nose. I was a liability because I was good at the job, and she didn't know why. Yes. It was such a small and specific thing to destroy someone's employment over. The not knowing. The inability to categorize what she was looking at. The discomfort of someone who performed at a level that exceeded the available explanation, and the institutional power to resolve that discomfort by removal, rather than by asking a different question. Hargrove seemed to understand that Emma needed a moment, because she sat quietly and didn't fill the space. What happens now? Emma said. Procedurally. The federal charges stand and move through the system. That will take months, possibly longer for some of the more complex conspiracy counts. The hospital's board is conducting an emergency governance review. Okafor has been asked to serve as acting chief of medicine with a mandate to implement reforms, which she has accepted. Hargrove turned to look at her. Your employment record is being formally corrected. Every annotation related to last night's incident, the security log, the detainment notation, the complaint, will be expunged from your personnel file and replaced with a federal documentation of the events as established by the investigation. Your file will also include, with your permission, a notation of your military service record, declassified to the level appropriate for a civilian employment context. Emma looked at her. Who decided that? Race formally requested it this morning, Hargrove said. I supported the request. The decision is yours. Emma was quiet. The idea of her personnel file containing both things, the civilian ER nurse who had worked 3 years without a blemish, and the combat medic who had kept 6 operators alive in a collapsed forward base, felt strange in a way she hadn't anticipated. For 3 years she'd maintained those two identities in separate compartments, and the separation had felt like protection. She hadn't anticipated how it would feel to have someone offer to close the distance between them on paper. Yes, she said. Include it. At 3:40 p.m., Lorraine Vass was walked out of the hospital's main administrative entrance by 2 federal agents and a third person who Emma recognized as Hargrove's senior attorney. Emma saw it because she was crossing the main lobby at that moment, coming from the elevator after a final check on Rice, and the timing was not planned. She had not arranged to be there. She had not come down to watch. But she was there. Vass was in her regular work clothes, the navy blazer she wore on administrative days, the kind of outfit assembled by someone who understood that clothing communicated authority. She looked smaller than Emma remembered, which was probably not literally true, but was the effect of context. She was not in handcuffs yet. That would happen in a more private location, but she was flanked on both sides and the body language of the agents was unambiguous. She saw Emma across the lobby. The moment lasted approximately 3 seconds. Emma didn't move toward her, didn't speak. She simply stood in the lobby of the hospital where she'd worked for 3 years and looked at the woman who had spent 9 days constructing a mechanism to end her career. And the looking was enough. It was not triumphant. It was not forgiving either. It was just honest. 2 people in a lobby, both fully aware of what had happened and what it had cost, and neither of them pretending otherwise. Vass looked away first. The agents moved her through the door, and the lobby returned to its ordinary sound and movement, and Emma stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, and then walked to the nursing station and picked up the chart she'd come downstairs for, and did what she'd been doing all night and all day, which was the next thing. Rice was discharged to a military medical facility 6 days later, which was faster than Emma would have recommended, and slower than he'd wanted, which she told him was a perfect outcome for someone of his temperament. He laughed, which hurt him, and he said something impolite about her bedside manner, and she told him his drain output had been excellent, and he should drink more water, and the exchange was so ordinary and human that she thought about it for a long time afterward. Before he left, he looked at her and said, "Have you decided?" She'd had 6 days to think about it. 6 days of working the floor with an acting chief of medicine who was asking questions that hadn't been asked before, and a nursing staff that was quieter and more careful with each other than it had been, and 2 phone calls from Renata Solis, who was participating in the federal investigation and had started, cautiously, to talk about returning to nursing. 6 days of doing the next thing, and thinking about what came after the next thing. "Yes," she said. He waited. "I'll do the consultation role," she said, part-time. "The knowledge transfer program." She paused. "On the condition that the program includes civilian nurses, not just the military side. If the point is translation, it works both directions. He looked at her. Something in his face settled. Done. And I'm staying on the floor here, she said. Whatever the new administration looks like, I'm not leaving. I didn't expect you to. She adjusted his discharge paperwork. Drink water, she said. Sleep when you're supposed to sleep. Don't look at classified briefs for at least 2 weeks. 2 weeks, he said, as though this were an unreasonable number. 2 weeks, she said, and meant it. The federal charges were formally filed on a Thursday, 6 weeks after the night in the parking lot. Pruitt faced 7 counts, including civil rights violations, evidence fabrication, and conspiracy. The last count shared with Vass and Stokes, who faced their own stacked charges that their respective attorneys were already in the process of negotiating and that the U.S. Attorney's Office was in the process of declining to negotiate. The Ashford PD's Internal Affairs Division was placed under a federal consent decree and a monitor was appointed. 3 additional officers were suspended pending investigation. The Board of Redwood Regional issued a public statement that was 2 pages long and used the word accountability 11 times and the word sorry twice, and that Hargrove told Emma privately was the minimum acceptable response, and that Okafor had pushed significantly harder for than what ended up on the page. Renata Solis received a formal federal acknowledgement that her prior complaint had been suppressed, and that the suppression had been deliberate and documented. She called Emma the day it arrived in her email and said, "It's not enough." And Emma said, "No." And Solis said, "But it's something." And Emma said, "Yes, it's something." And they both understood that the distance between those 2 statements was where most of justice actually lived, not in the clean resolution, but in the imperfect, partial, still better than nothing space that was all any institution had ever actually offered. The military's public recognition came on a Friday in November, in a function room at a building in Ashford that Emma had never been inside, with Calloway present and Okafor present and Marsh present and Ortega, who had asked if he could come and whom Emma had told yes without hesitation. The citation read her name and her unit and her commendations. It described her actions in terms that were still partially redacted but clear enough in outline. It was read aloud by a general she'd never met who had clearly read the file and understood what he was reading. And when he finished, there was a silence in the room before the applause that felt like something real. Not the performed quiet of ceremony, but the genuine kind. The kind that comes when people have been given information that requires a moment to absorb. Emma stood at the front of the room in a blazer she'd bought specifically for this occasion and which did not entirely fit because she'd bought it in a hurry and the sleeves were slightly long, and she thought about the specific absurdity of standing here in an ill-fitting blazer being recognized by an institution she'd quietly served and quietly left and then served again without intending to, all because a woman in a navy jacket had decided that competence she couldn't explain was a liability. She thought about what Solis had said. I calculated the cost, and I decided I couldn't afford to be right. She thought about how close she'd come to making the same calculation. How in the security office, waiting through 40 minutes of deliberate delay with blood on her wrists and her bag upended on the table, she had run the math. She had thought about the lease on her apartment and the 3 years she'd spent building something quiet and functional, and she had weighed what it would cost to fight versus what it would cost to let it go. She had done the arithmetic, and she had decided, not heroically, not because she was certain it would work out, but because she was made of the particular stubbornness that refuses to cooperate with its own erasure, that she was not going to perform her own disappearance on someone else's schedule. She hadn't known about Pruitt's prior arrangements. She hadn't known about the other nurses. She hadn't known that a JAG colonel was already in the air, or that Commander Rice would end up on a table in Bay 1 with a tension pneumothorax nobody else had caught. She had only known that she had done nothing wrong, and that saying so, clearly and precisely and without apology, was the only thing available to her that felt like integrity. It had been enough. It had been, barely and imperfectly and with a great deal of things going right that could have gone wrong, enough. After the ceremony, Ortega found her by the coffee table and stood next to her in the companionable way of someone who doesn't need to make an occasion larger than it is. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. "How does it feel?" he said. She thought about it honestly, which he deserved. "Incomplete," she said. "And right, both at once." He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds about right for this kind of thing." She looked at the room. Calloway talking to Marsh in the corner, Okafor speaking with the general, the afternoon light coming through the windows in the particular way of November in Ashford, flat and clear, and without the softness of warmer months. She looked at her slightly too long sleeves and didn't straighten them. She thought about the woman who had spent 9 days building a mechanism to make her disappear. She thought about the camera Pruitt hadn't known existed. She thought about the hiss of a tension pneumothorax releasing under a needle in a trauma bay, the most honest sound in a room full of people who hadn't seen what she'd seen, and the patient's blood pressure climbing, and the moment Ferris exhaled. She thought about what it meant to be known, not recognized, not celebrated, but known. To have what you'd actually done exist on a record somewhere, attached to your name, indelible. She had spent 3 years being no one in particular in this city. A nurse who clocked in and did good work and went home and said nothing about the places she'd been or the things she'd learned in conditions that would have broken a different person. She had been quiet about it, not from shame, but from a particular species of privacy. The sense that what she'd carried didn't require an audience to be real, that she knew what she was, and that was sufficient. It had turned out not to be sufficient, not because she'd been wrong about herself, but because the world didn't always leave you the option of being quietly right. Sometimes the world came for you regardless, and the question was only what you did when it arrived. She had stayed. She had been precise. She had done the next thing and then the thing after that, and she had not performed her own smallness to make anyone else comfortable. And she had kept a man alive in a trauma bay, and the keeping had mattered in ways that extended past that room and that night and that hospital in ways she was still tracing. That was not a lesson she'd intended to learn on a Tuesday night in a wet parking lot, but she had learned it, and she was going to carry it into every room she walked into for the rest of her working life. The consultation roll, the hospital floor, the spaces between military and civilian medicine, where the translation work needed doing, and she was, apparently, one of the people built to do it. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but she would show up for it, and she would be honest about what she saw, and she would not pretend to be less than she was to serve someone else's comfort. The coffee was bad. The sleeves were long. Ortega was telling her something about the hospital's new security contract, and she was half listening and half watching the room and thinking about how none of this had been what she planned and how it was, nonetheless, exactly where she was supposed to be. Sometimes the only power anyone has over you is the power you hand them by staying quiet. She was done being